Hey everybody, Dave Durante with Power Monkey Fitness back here again. Today we're going to be talking about some handstand mechanics. We're going to be talking specifically about handstand floaters. Now this exercise can be used in a really reliable and easy way to work on a specific portion of your handstand related to the stability component. Now when we talk about a well-rounded handstand, there's really three components that I like to focus on: strength, position, and stability. Position and stability normally get neglected a ton because everyone's focus is on just staying upside down, and we end up neglecting a little bit of the important subtle factors that come along with stability and position. Today, this exercise will hopefully give you the ability to understand a little bit more about the subtle aspects of what stability looks like. And in reality, there are two major components to the stability of a handstand. There's macro stability and micro stability, and we're going to discuss a little bit more about each of those components. Okay, with regards to our handstand floater, a couple things we want to be talking about in terms of setup, all right? So first will be just in terms of where our hands are going to be placed. We want to make sure that those fingertips are facing forward. Ideally, we're looking for a setup where your index finger and or middle finger are facing at 12 o'clock. That's going to give us the best setup in terms of making sure that our fingertips are fully engaged. If you're turning your hands out a little bit, what we're going to end up doing is seeing a lot of disengagement from your outside fingers, and you're going to be focusing a little bit more on just getting the index finger and the thumb involved with that handstand, which is really limiting as we start talking about higher level versions of the handstand. We want to be able to engage all the way through those fingertips. So if you are a person who's working on your handstands and has a tendency to be turning out, what we need to be doing with you is working much more on mobility and strength drills specifically for the wrist to slowly start turning that hand forward so we can get more out of those fingertips, specifically to be utilized for the stability component. All right? Fingertips facing forward. Hands are going to be shoulder width apart, and we're going to define that middle finger to the outside of the shoulder as our shoulder width. This is going to be more of an artistic gymnastics approach to our shoulder width, and we're going to use that as our setup for our hands. Okay, now with the setup for our floaters, there's two different versions that we can be working on, all right? You can do stomach to wall and back to wall. The first one that we're going to show you here is going to be back to wall. It's going to be the one that's maybe a little bit more common that you're going to see just because of the ease of coming in and out of it. The distance away from the wall is going to be one of the key components to being able to understand how this works. The closer you are to the wall, the more vertical you'll be, so the more subtle the adjustments need to be able to find a balance point. You won't need to do very much against the ground to be able to find where that weight is stabilized. The further you are away from the wall, if you want to start with a little bit more distance, it's going to give you a little bit of an easier starting point because you're kind of falling into the wall at a more severe angle, but it's going to be much more difficult to dig into the ground to peel your feet and weight away from the wall because of that distance. So there's some pluses and minuses to the distance being short or far away from the wall, depending on what you're trying to get out of it. Ideally, the setup should be about 8 to 10 inches, maximum a foot away from the wall in terms of where the midpoint of your palm is as a starting point. So we're going to look for that in terms of the distance away. Okay, so the setup, as I said, is going to be a distance away from the wall. Shorter, closer to the wall, it's going to be a little bit more subtle. A little further away from the wall, you have more stability, but it's going to be a little bit more challenging to actually get that weight stabilized. So ideally, we're going to start off at about a foot away from the wall. Mid-palm is going to be a good starting point for people that are doing this for the first time. Back to wall, and again, the specific reason for this drill is to feel the fingers digging into the ground. If I can see the white of your knuckles, it means that the exercise is working for you, okay? I don't want you to be kicking away from the wall. You don't want to be thinking about creating momentum. If you're kicking off the wall, you're going to miss the subtlety of the exercise. So it should be very, very easy. Don't feel like anything too drastic is happening. Initiating through the fingers, rest of the body is going along for the ride. Let's take a look. Mid-palm, about a foot away from the wall. Again, index finger, middle finger facing at that 12 o'clock. We'll get into that wall-facing handstand. Heels against the wall, only the heels touching. You'll try to find that nice line, and if you can see what my hands are doing, I'm just pulsing into the ground to give you a visual of how aggressive those hands are into the ground. As I start to push those fingertips down, my heels will slowly peel away as my weight starts to distribute more on top of those hands. So this is all coming from those hands and those fingertips. As I get more and more subtle with that driving of the fingertips into the ground, the weight from my shoulders and then hips and then feet will slowly start to find a balance point. And the subtlety will be able to be felt through those fingertips. It's nothing drastic. Little by little, you will have a little aha moment where you'll go from just using the wall from a strength standpoint to incorporating more of a stability component, which will start to incorporate more of a well-rounded handstand, which is what we're looking for. All right, so this next version is going to be our stomach to wall version of our floater. There's a lot of benefits to working on stomach to wall. The reason why we normally don't teach it first is because people have trouble doing stomach to wall if they're not so comfortable from the strength side of a handstand. Getting in and out of a stomach to wall handstand can be a little bit challenging for people right off the bat. But it does have a lot of value in terms of, again, building that well-rounded handstand because we can reincorporate a little bit of a positional component that we lose when we're doing a back to wall version. Back to wall has a tendency to put us into a little too much of an arch where our heels are drifting over the top, which takes us away from that ideal perfectly stacked handstand. When we go stomach to wall, we can slowly start to put that stacked position back into place, which again allows us to be thinking about an exercise from a strength component, positional component now, and of course what we're really focusing on the stability side. Anytime we can do an exercise that has all three of those phases in place, I consider that a very high-end level of an exercise because you're thinking about it from all different perspectives, strength, stability, and position all in one. This ideally will consider all three of those sides. Okay, so the stomach to wall version, you can get into it in a variety of ways. If you're a little bit more proficient with your handstand, you can kind of do a cartwheel up into it if you're comfortable with that. You can also just kind of put your hands down and step up into it. If you're new to this, but feeling strong enough to get in there, you can do a full wall walk up. Whatever's gonna get you in a position comfortably. So we'll do kind of a semi-wall walk here. Again, distance away from the wall will matter. We're gonna try to be, again, about that foot away from the wall. Fingers in that same setup from our back to wall version. Now what we're going to be looking for here is one leg coming away from the wall, letting the hips and shoulders follow, and you'll see my secondary foot slowly start to peel away from the wall. It's very subtle. It's just an action to get the weight on top of my hands, shifting it from the heel of my hand up towards mid palm, and then eventually again getting those fingertips engaged to find that balance point. Very, very subtle, nothing drastic. What we will generally see with someone who's a little too aggressive is driving that foot way past. There'll be a little bit of shifting so far forward that they'll have to step down or cartwheel out. I want you guys to be thinking about always keeping the weight within that slight angle that's short of handstand. And you play with that distance little by little to always think about the stability side. If you're too aggressive and that foot comes way over, peeling you away from your handstand, you know you were a little bit too aggressive. Stay on the subtle side, stay on the short side of your handstand. Think about it from the shoulders, then the hips, then the foot slowly starting to peel away from the wall. The fingertips again are going to be what your stabilization comes from. You'll feel the fingertips dig into the ground, and like I said from before, it will add the positional component to your handstand. Not only will you be able to feel the fingertips engage, but ideally we'll be able to find a position where that foot is in line with the knee, the hip, the shoulder, the elbow, and the hand, finding that nice stacked line. Position, strength, and stability all together in the same exercise. This is going to be a wrist exercise, a fingertip exercise that I like to do a lot in terms of preparation for any handstand work that I do, but it has a lot of value, one for just prepping the forearms and prepping the hands in terms of positional components, but also starting to feel a little bit more how the fingertips play a role in the handstand, specifically as it pertains to the stability side of things. So the setup will be very much like any setup that we'd have with our handstand, shoulder width apart, defines that middle finger to the outside of the shoulder, and we're going to be thinking again about middle finger, index finger facing closer to that 12 o'clock. So the way this one's going to work, we have a few different variations that we can play with. This more simplified version will be from all fours, where you'll be on your knees. Elbows will be fully locked out, shoulder on top of that hand. And what we're going to be looking for here is driving the forefingers down into the ground, lifting the palms and thumbs off the ground, and guiding yourself back down to that starting point. So the ascent and the descent will be at the same pace. You're not done until you're back at that starting point where your palms fully flat down on the ground. Thinking about going through these reps, 10 reps, 2 rounds is kind of a good place to start out with this. Each round, slowly come out of it, shake those hands out, roll the wrists out, make sure you're prepped and ready to go for the next round. One level up from here is going to be from a full plank. Instead of thinking about both hands coming off the ground together, you're going to be doing a shift. So we'll initiate the shift from the shoulder, lift the opposing hand off the ground. Again, 4 fingers staying on the ground. Thumbs can come up with the palm. Thinking about first making sure the initiation comes from the shoulder, and then the rest of the body goes along for the ride. With this one, still 10 reps, 5 on each side is a good starting point. 2 rounds, shaking out the wrist between each round is a good place to be. Eventually, over time, this is not going to be something that happens right away. I guarantee you this is going to be deceptively challenging. It's going to be a lot harder than it might seem. This is going to be working towards being able to do the full raise from a full plank. The way this one looks, from that nice hollow plank position, keeping the head neutral, driving both hands down into the ground, lifting the palms off, and then slowly guiding back down again. Just like we saw in that all four version when you were on your knees, same thing, guiding on the way up and on the way down. This version is not easy. I guarantee you're going to get there and your mind is going to be disconnected from your body. You're going to try to push into the ground and most likely nothing will happen. But the objective will be to try to stay as hollow and as in initial position as possible. And don't feel like you're trying to generate any power from the hips. I don't want to see any shifting with this final version. Think about making sure that both hands are working together. We'll show you a couple different variations with this particular exercise. The first one is going to be with a plate. We'll start as light as possible, but a single plate is going to make sure that you can have both hands working together, and then we'll slowly build towards something a little bit more challenging. Starting with a 10-pound plate is kind of a good place because I really want you to have an understanding of what the objective is, what it's supposed to look like before you add any additional load. You don't have to worry about getting too heavy with this until you have a really good understanding of what the objective is. So 10 pounds, like we talked about primarily with some of the other exercises, the fingertip engagement, what's going to be happening through the wrist is a good kind of starting point with getting a little bit more stable with our handstands. So the way this one's going to work, we're going to get the plate up overhead. I want the fingers, if your shoulders are a little bit wider, you're going to end up going a little bit closer to the edges of the plate. But I want you to try to stay as stacked as possible, thinking about that same setup position that we were previously with our handstands. So what we're going to be looking for here is, one, trying to get our shoulder angle as close to open as possible. So if you're watching from the side, you'll see the difference between a shoulder angle here and my ability to get the shoulder angle at 180 degrees, eventually a little bit beyond 180 degrees. But for this particular drill, staying at 180 is going to be ideal. Feet are going to be together, and we're going to be thinking about squeezing our butt to really engage that posterior pelvic tilt that we think about, that hollow position from the lower hip. Turning under, eye line will be right between those thumbs, so your ears will be right up against your shoulder. And what we're going to be thinking about doing here is slowly starting to push that plate through our fingertips and wrists just to feel some of the range of motion that comes along with that wrist and fingertip engagement. Feeling the weight move back and forth in control the entire time, making sure the shoulders down through the feet, nothing is moving, you're creating one straight line, only working through the forearms, through the wrists, and through those fingertips. With this particular drill, starting with 10 pounds, building up towards 25, and then beyond is kind of how I'd like to see it. 10 reps back and forth. Normally, if I'm teaching a class, I would probably do between 2 and 3 sets of 10 reps as a good way to get the wrists ready to go before we get inverted. From there, what we can slowly start to do is have independent weight. So instead of having one plate, we would slowly start to add independent weight in the form of some change plates. These are 5s. You can start out with 2.5s or something a little bit lighter. But because these are a little bit lighter, there will be some instability that comes along with. So the setup, I like to have something like this. My palm flat with my middle finger wrapped around the inside of that center hole so that I can keep it nice and locked out the entire time. Finger on that middle point. Again, same setup as we saw with the previous drill. Squeezing that butt, keeping the shoulders nice and open, and again, working through that independence. You can start out with both weights moving in the same direction, and then eventually what we'll do is slowly start to rock back and forth, feeling the difference from one hand to the other, making sure we understand that once we start getting more involved with our handstands, that there will be some shifting that requires us to go from one hand to the other. The weight distribution and stabilization will not always be equal from one hand to the other, so we want to start feeling one hand do a little bit more, one hand doing a little bit less, so we can start activating accordingly to where that fatigue sets in. If you're a little more dominant on one side, you're going to notice that you'll probably fall on the opposing side. So being able to feel that stabilization from one hand to the other, we'll start to be able to work our way towards that more well-rounded and higher level handstand. So what we're going to be looking for here, the objective is to make sure that we understand that the fingertips are going to be digging into the ground as our starting point. to slowly peel the shoulders, then hips, then feet away from the wall. It should be kind of a chain reaction, with the fingertips kind of initiating that movement. The more you dig into the ground, the more your weight will start to shift on top of your hands, and you won't have to worry about initiating from the lower half. What we're trying to do here is make sure that you're starting to feel how important the fingers are in controlling what's going on from a stabilization standpoint. I always tell people it's like playing piano against the ground. Very, very subtle. All the fingertips are involved. It shouldn't be anything too drastic, and you shouldn't think about initiating from the shoulders or from the hips. This is where the subtle or micro stability comes from, the subtle adjustments that come through the fingertips, and that's going to be where we're starting from.